So we're here at the International Transpersonal Conference in Prague, and I'm here with Robert Hahn, who's a director at the Institute of Ecotechnics, who do research in coral reefs and rainforests and such like, and conservation work, and they're well known for setting up Biosphere 2. So you have significant experience with Datura. How well is this documented in Vedic scriptures?
The Datura use, I actually cannot tell you. I do know that its use dates to prehistory, and of course I documented the use of it with the Hindu Swami who initiated me into it in the Entheogen review a number of years ago in English and German. I only found brief references to it in Vedic scripture when I was doing the research in London, in India, preparing the article that I wrote after the work with Swami Dharam Jyoti in Nepal. And while his work went back into the Sanskrit teachings, I don't know if the Datura was a tradition that was also passed on but never written down. My guess is that it was, because it was older Swamis, if you will, who originally took Swami Dharam Jyoti from his family when he was 6 years old, and his family agreed to let him go. They said, this young boy has potential, and either you give him to us now at the age of 6, or he'll grow up like everyone else. And of course we know, because he was just approaching the age of reason, and that's when he began his Datura use. So I would say from my review of the literature so far that there is no report of the use, and that is probably just something they didn't feel like writing down, or didn't see it as an essential spiritual, if you will, component.
Do you think that this could possibly be the evasive, legendary entheogen soma?
It's an interesting question, because I looked into that when I was preparing my article from the work I did, and I couldn't find anything definitive. There were stories, and it may or may not have been, so it's still an open question, at least in my research.
Now, I don't really have any experience as such consuming Datura, but when I went trekking in Colombia a few years back, in the jungle, 4 days, there was one night where we stayed by a waterfall in hammocks, and we were surrounded by Datura plants, and I had the most crazy lucid dream that night. And I woke up, went to breakfast, and everyone had the craziest dreams. And how could that be the effect of just sleeping beside the plants?
Well, Datura is an extremely toxic and strong plant. It's classified as a deliriant, and at night the flowers give off this wonderful odor which you were breathing in all night. So it's quite understandable that had an effect on your sleep. And because some of the properties we know of Datura do affect, will put you into a sleep state, the equivalent of a sleep state where you have no memory of what occurred.
The only thing I could compare the dreams to were when I did the anti-malarial drug, the really cheap one. I think it's doxycycline, the one that makes you go a bit crazy and have really weird dreams.
Doxycycline can do that. Malarone.
It was the really cheap one.
Doxycycline.
Probably doxycycline, yeah.
It was almost identical to that.
Yeah.
So going back to the Swami that you spent a lot of time with, did he use it purely for the spiritual journey? Was it like a visionary plant to him, or is it more of an effect on diminishing the ego so that you see truth and you see through the illusions of the mind? mind, and particularly the egoic mind?
I would say that it's not necessarily either or neither, if you will, because Swami had such a long use of it. I think we can hypothesize that maybe at the beginning, when he was a young man, and of course he started as a young boy, that it had a visionary side to it that opened him up in a more spiritual way and deepened his understanding of the Vedic scriptures, of the Sanskrit materials he was studying. Later on, as I've mentioned, he told me that he couldn't remember his Sanskrit studies that had been done on Datura in state-specific knowledge unless he was on Datura, which he was essentially all of the time.
So in a way it might tap into a region of the brain or the mind which is very, very difficult to reach by maybe even conventional or psychedelics or meditation or other rituals or yoga.
I believe it is, and I think some of this is related to the sleep state, dream or non-dream state, where it opens up your access to the unconscious. Now, the way I've been using it, which is in smaller doses, smoking it, I believe that it's more useful in that sense for self-study and therapy, because you can remain conscious. Not to say that it doesn't have its use, which it has been used for millennia, in rites of passage, where you do want to have a completely delirious state, have a break with your ordinary waking consciousness and memory, so that you can come in contact with deeper visions that might then bring you, say, a rite of passage through puberty into manhood for a man. And I don't know if it's used in women's rites of passage, of which, of course, there aren't that many in Western culture, except that we do know that the witches used it in European history.
So people often say that with certain other entheogens, such as San Pedro or Ayahuasca, you get a distinct feeling of an entity, the embodiment of the plant medicine. So with San Pedro, it's distinctly male. With Ayahuasca, they refer to it as Mother Ayahuasca, feminine entity. Would you say there's a similar association with Datura? Is there a distinct entity present?
I would say that it is more of a feminine type of entity, because it opens you up and it makes your vision, your hearing more acute, so you're in obviously a much more sensitive state, a more open state, and there's a certain unfocusing quality to the experience, which would be more akin to a feminine rather than masculine state of consciousness.
They also say about Ayahuasca that you can go the furthest. You really surf the cosmic plane of consciousness. You go into the purely conscious realm, and you can go the furthest with Ayahuasca. And for Iboga, it's to go deepest within. Would you say there's a similar aspect to Datura?
Well, to a certain extent. And Datura is used as an admixture by some ayahuasqueros. I would say that the limit, which would be in some ways similar to ayahuasca, is that if you increase the dose to the point where you lose consciousness, then you've gone sort of beyond a realm that you can work in, except later, to try to harvest what happened there. And I suppose a similar thing can happen with ayahuasca, but in my experience, where I've taken extremely large doses of ayahuasca, I was able to retain consciousness of that state in the experience. So I think that's where Datura crosses a different line, if you will, that where you enter, a state where you completely lose consciousness, then I'd question its usefulness except as, say, a rite of passage.
I actually have a couple of friends that did Datura in Ayahuasca. Now they'd done Ayahuasca well over 100 times all over South America, and they said that when it had the Datura admixture, everything was like freeze framed, like they saw reality in maybe 2 or 3 frames per second, and it was like a slowed down movie, perhaps, and they said that it was the most intense ayahuasca experience they've ever had, and they'd never want to do it again, but they said after they've never felt so healed. So it reminded me of Alan Watts's phrase when he said you need to go out of your mind to come to your senses, and in their experience they went so far out of their mind that they felt so much more connected and reset after.
Yeah, I would describe that as kind of going through the wick-wack of time, and so, which does seem to be a very useful effect in terms of healing or other types of work. And combined with the ayahuasca, they were able to maintain that consciousness, but still go into the void and come back out. And so allow, in a way, everything to disconnect long enough that you could have a rearrangement of neural patterns, if you will, however you want to look at that change in consciousness and its physical effect within the brain.
Recently there's been a rapid renaissance in psychedelic therapy and research, but I've never come across anyone researching the therapeutic potential of Datura. How would you pitch this to a research team as possibly a therapeutic potential or a necessary requirement for the benefit of humanity and the planet?
Well, the way I phrased it in the talk I gave yesterday here in Prague at the International Transpersonal Conference was that I delineated, and others have done this as well, different states of consciousness for therapy, beginning with an ordinary waking state, mild intoxication, say everything from coffee to marijuana to kava, and then the level I'd put Datura at, which is a state of mild delirium, you could say, at least disorientation, and then of course you get into the psychedelics. So I think that it can potentially fill a void, and part of that is because one, it's short acting when it's smoked, could be less than an hour, at the most 2 hours, depending on how much you ingest.
And when consumed, ingested?
No, smoking it.
And how about when it's ingested?
I do not recommend ingesting it. The effects are too unpredictable, and they can range anywhere from almost nothing to death. So I think we have to really very seriously respect the fact that Datura is properly classified as a dangerous plant. It isn't, on the other hand, illegal in most places. There are a couple of states in the US and I'm sure some countries, but because of that, it is easily accessible, and so it would give a new tool to therapists to take a patient from the ordinary state or mild intoxication state to a place where they could begin to explore their inner processes before, say, going to a psychedelic and the type of work that you would do at that level.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. It seems Datura's got a really bad rap, especially after the Vice documentary where it was shown to be used for in Colombia especially, where people blow it in a victim's face, and then they like lose their will, and they'll do whatever they tell them, like give them all their money, go to the cash point and withdraw all their cash, and etc. etc. And by sharing your insights, hopefully people would, especially scientists and psychologists, would be more open to its potential.
Well, that would be my hope, and it's interesting because that's also how it was used by the Thugis in India, who were worshippers of Kali, and they would use it to stupefy their victims before they robbed them or perhaps even killed them. And it was reportedly, we believe, used by the Mayans to prepare victims who were going to be killed as a ritual death before that. So, and that's one of the reasons I so strongly emphasize the dangerous qualities of it and the use of it through smoking so that you can titrate the effect. And I'm welcoming people to, communicate their experiences if they do decide to try to use it in a therapeutic setting.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think we'll round up the interview there. Thank you so much for your time and your great work with the Institute of Ecotechnics.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you down under.